everyone. Matt, thank you for the introduction. So like Matt said, my name is Megan Mitchell. I worked for the U.S. Department of Education in the Office for Civil Rights for almost a decade before opening up my own firm. Along with that, I'm also the child of a school psychologist, so I grew up in the world of 504s and IEPs being normal dinner conversation. So this presentation today, what I wanted to cover is kind of Tier 1, what is 504, IDEA, for kind of the basics, and then kind of go into more details about accommodations, tips and tricks, and kind of the process. And one of the biggest things is the buzzwords that can help throughout the process. So first off, what is Section 504 in the IDEA? Section 504 is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination for individuals with disabilities. 504 ensures that students with disabilities have equal access to education. And the IDEA is a law that ensures that students with disabilities have access to an education that meets their unique needs. If you've heard about 504s and IEPs, Section 504 governs 504s, IDEA governs IEPs. Largely, the rules that cover a 504 cover an IEP. A lot of the times you'll see kind of this Venn diagram. It's really IEPs, IDEA is a bubble within 504. So the rights, you'll hear occasionally folks will say, oh, if you've got an IEP, you'll need a 504 for X, Y, and Z. That's not the case. If you've got an IEP, 504 needs can be included within that. But these are the two laws that govern education disability rights. So what is a disability under Section 504? It is a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Has a record of such impairments, or is regarded as having such impairment. So this first one is the kind of key definition, and we're going to talk about how you meet that definition and what kind of it means. So what is a major life activity? This list of verbs, it's pretty much anything that you can think of can kind of be shimmied within this list and more. These major life activities are a buzzword that can be used to make really clear what needs need to be met. So it can include caring for oneself, manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, working, and others. So a lot of things that make school hard can fall within one of these areas. And these are buzzwords that can be used to say the major life activity impacted is eating. The major life activity impacted is breathing. And we're going to get to talk about these in a second. But first one is, so a disability is an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. What does substantially limit mean? Unable to perform major life activity. That the average person in the general population can perform, or substantially restricted as to the condition, matter, or duration under which the average person in the general population can perform that major life activity. So going back to that list, we can look at breathing. The question is not, is this person able to breathe? Is the student able to breathe? If the answer to that is no, okay, we need to seek medical attention right now, because if we're not breathing, there's a problem. But we're looking at, is breathing limited? Is it harder? Is it after running a mile or sitting in a certain position? Is breathing harder? Okay, then that major life activity is impacted. It's not a yes, no. It's the matter or duration impacted. So this can be writing. This can be, okay, yeah, the student can use a pencil right now, but it's harder to use a pencil after a couple hours. And so we're looking at not just, is this a yes, no? Is this a yes, no in every condition that a average person in the general population could do? So looking at Section 504 and IEPs, the kind of big breakdown here is that Section 504 is dealing with any student with a disability with a major life activity that's substantially impacted. IEP comes into play when the student needs specialized instruction. This can be additional learning supports, but this can also be the need for the course to be modified because of additional aides or PT or OT. So in IEP, often you'll hear, or not often, hopefully not often, but occasionally you'll hear people say, oh, if there's not a learning impairment, we don't need an IEP. Don't shake your head. I don't want that to be true. That's not true. If there is any modification for specialized instruction, then an IEP should be in place. You can have a really strong 504 that isn't an IEP. You can have a pretty weak IEP that can do the same thing as a 504. But we get into the question of specialized instruction. With the IEP, you get some additional procedural safeguards. 504s, there has to be a grievance process. With under IDEA, you have more safeguards to fight, to push back. And so having that IEP can sometimes not only allow for additional education, but can allow for additional safeguards. So schools must make appropriate accommodations under Section 504 to eliminate barriers to the students' participation in school activities. Implementation of Section 504 provides students with disabilities the same access to educational opportunities as their peers without disabilities. And then, like I said, IEPs include that, but with the additional element of specialized instruction. IEP is only for 13 specified conditions, which include orthopedic impairment, which if you're here is probably the category we're going to be falling within. There can be others. Once you've checked the IEP box, the nuance of why exactly we're here is not as critical. Once you kind of got the IEP, we're just looking at the student as a whole. I've seen some parents kind of stick on, I want disability services for X, Y, and Z. If you can get the service under one thing, we're looking at the student as a whole. That qualification may not be quite as important. Once you've checked that box for support, you should be getting support for the whole student. And then school-based occupational therapy and physical therapy, as well as other therapies, fall under IDEA. So we're looking at IEP, that's specialized instruction. That's where we're getting, hey, it's not just intellectual impairment. It's not just we're changing the school curriculum and teaching them something different. It's the way the school day looks, the way material is given is different. So this is, when I talk with parents about disabilities, kind of the most important flow chart, which as I look at it up here, for the most important flow chart, I probably should have increased the contrast, but here we are. So the biggest thing that we can think about when dealing with 504 is disability, major life activity, accommodation. To get the accommodations, the best way to explain it to the school is say, we've determined there is a disability. This disability impacts this major life activity. The major life activity that's impacted by the disability can be ameliorated by this accommodation or support services. When parents come in and just say, I want this support service, school can go, okay, cool, that I want a pony. But if you can say, this, we have determined as a group that this student is a student with a disability. We have determined as a group that this student with a disability has this major life activity impacted. And we have documented a need that this accommodation or support ameliorates the impact on that major life activity that this disability has. It's very hard for a school at that point in time to say no. So if we can connect 1, 2, 3, it's a lot harder legally to say no. So when I'm representing families, that's where I'm always tying. And I'm asking my folks if we're writing letters, if we're getting support letters from doctors or PTs or support staff or family members that work with the student, I'm saying to tie these 3 things together because that's the way we can most clearly connect for the school the need to provide the service. So looking at the process. So step 1 in kind of getting a plan in place is evaluation. If there is a suspect, or if there is a concern that it's suspected that the student may have a disability or need for related services, the school must evaluate. There are times where I see parents and family members come in and say, I'm worried about this kid. And the school goes, oh yeah, us too. We need to use the buzzwords. I suspect that the student may need related services to trigger that evaluation. When we're on that line and the school's not wanting to maybe go forward, using those buzzwords can help make sure that they're triggering their evaluation process. And either the school or the student's guardians may raise that suspected need. Once the need has been raised, the school must convene a team meeting to initiate evaluation services and reconvene to determine eligibility. So the first meeting is everyone coming together to determine, what are we evaluating? What are we evaluating for? Are we evaluating pencil grip? Are we evaluating need for PT, OT? Do we have intellectual disabilities that we have a concern for? Is there something we need to bring the school psychologist in for? The question is, what evaluation needs to be done? Because that's going to determine what services we're looking at. This is a good time to push for a broad evaluation, making sure that as many things are evaluated as possible so that we know what we're looking at. Because I've seen cases where they evaluate for one thing, and then later it's like, oh, we need support services for this. And I go, oh, we haven't evaluated for that. We have to go back and reevaluate. So that first meeting is a really good time to push for a broad evaluation. Once that evaluation has been done, the team must reconvene to determine eligibility, and then at that point in time, write the 504, the IEP plan. Once a team reconvenes, that's when we're going back to, again, what is the disability? Check that box, yes. Is there major life activity impacted? Check that box, yes. If so, what accommodation and support services do we need to support the major life activities that are impacted? One important note that I wish more folks understood is everybody hears we must evaluate after 3 years. But you may review a plan at the request of either school staff or the guardian at any point in time. If you get an IEP in place in a week and it's clearly not working, you can say to the school, we need to reevaluate. We need a team meeting right now. They may say, oh, but it's only been a week, let's see. I would like a meeting. That team can reconvene as many times as you want. As an advocate, I weigh that. Are we going to burn a bridge? But you don't have to wait for that 3 year. You can push for a review of the meeting. You can push for a reevaluation if you think there is a reason to reevaluate. If there is something new going on, you can push for reevaluation prior to that 3 year mark. What does the team need to look like, and kind of what are the things we need to know about IEP and 504 teams? It needs to be a team of people knowledgeable about the student. They must consider all relevant information. This means the letters from doctors you bring in, the letters from family members you bring in. If you have a grandparent, guardian, cousin who's with the student regularly, you can bring in a letter from them. They don't have to be on the phone. They don't have to be there. You can bring in information talking about how this person observes the student at home, what they observe work. If you've got a cousin who's in every day and, hey, when we do this, it really works. It really helps. You can bring that letter in and it must be considered. It doesn't mean they're going to follow it, but they legally have to at least consider it. The IEP and the 504 team cannot consider positive effects of mitigating measures. This can be interpreted pretty broadly, but what this means, kind of the easiest way I think to think about it is for ADHD, if you're on a medication that helps with focus. You can't say when this child is taking this medication, everything's better, so they're not a student with a disability. That is a mitigating measure with positive side effects. But the thing is, mitigating measures aren't always there. Medication may be forgotten. Medication may wear off. A measure may not work that day. Hey, if I'm always doing this, if we are always eating the perfect breakfast, things are working a little smoother and this major life activity isn't impacted. We have to think about what is kind of that worst case. What does the bad days look like? What does it look like when there aren't those mitigating measures? And making sure that's taken into consideration. So if we eat a great breakfast, everything is good. Well, sometimes the kitchen's under renovation, breakfast gets skipped, everybody slept in. What do we need to have in place in the days we skip breakfast when medication isn't working? The school cannot require a guardian to pay for evaluation. There's some tricky stuff when it comes to reevaluation and private evaluations, but they can never come and say, oh, well, we don't evaluate for X, Y, or Z. If you want that evaluation, you have to pay for it. If they don't deem it within kind of the realm of what the concern is, they may say no. But for the most part, they should not ever have any requirement to pay for evaluation. Additionally, you can ask for an IEE, which is an independent educational evaluation. If you disagree with the findings of their evaluation, you can ask for an IEE, which is a private evaluation that they must pay for. That comes with some pros, some cons, because it still is an evaluation of the school's choosing. You don't get to say, hey, I want this specialist to do the evaluation and you pay for it. They may pick that, they may not, but you can always request a second evaluation at no cost. There must be a grievance process. They must notify the parties of that process. For the most part, you'll see that schools are pretty good about this. You'll get in that meeting, the first thing they do is, we emailed you, did you get the papers? Would you like a copy of the papers? We have extra copies of the papers. This isn't something I typically see missed, but most importantly, know there is a process. Check out those papers. If you disagree, you got an email at some point in time that has, most likely, hopefully, that has that grievance process. And decisions cannot be made outside of the team. This is good and this is bad. The good of this is you can't hear, hey, the teachers were talking and we decided this isn't working, so we stopped doing it. No, that is immediately a failure to properly modify the plan. That is a violation of federal law, the end. Where that can be tricky is if you're on the phone with the teacher and it's going, hey, this accommodation just isn't working. Can we cut it? And the teacher goes, yeah, we can. Nope, we got to call a team meeting. But what I don't hear utilized a lot, and I suggest, especially when I was at Ed, that we do is team meetings can be quick. Team meetings can be, let's get on the phone for 5 minutes. Hey, everybody, this one isn't working. Can we agree to modify? Cool, I'll send out that plan via email real fast. But make sure the decisions are being made inside the team. And if you're hearing situations where decisions are being made where you're not part of that process, you can bring it back to, hey, the plan we've got in place is the plan we've got in place. Unless we're making that meeting or making that decision within the scope of a meeting, those decisions aren't working. So make sure that the team is involved. You can also advocate for who you want in the team. You may not always get it, but if there's a great teacher, a teacher who gets it, even a teacher who was there last year who's not a teacher for your student now, ask to bring them in. A lot of the times the school will say yes if you're asking. If there is a counselor, if there is a person that is really working, get them on the team. You can have support people. If you've got a person, a friend, who makes you feel okay, who makes you feel safe, bring them. Have them sit beside you. They don't have to talk, but you can ask to have that extra body with you for that team meeting. Be aware that the bigger the team meeting gets, the more chaos we have. So try and keep that in mind. But work and you have the freedom to work and advocate to build a team that works best for you. Also, don't be afraid to bring in the worst teacher into that meeting. If you have a teacher who is notoriously underserving the student, that may be the best teacher to have in that meeting so that they're hearing the needs. They're seeing the paperwork. A lot of the times I see parents go, oh, Miss Smith in English is the best. She cares so much. She never misses a thing. Let's definitely have Miss Smith in the meeting. But if Mr. Park is the worst teacher who is never doing anything, does not go above and beyond, is really where our student is struggling, get Mr. Park in the meeting too. Make sure that the 504 coordinator, that team, is aware that Mr. Park is not meeting those needs. And also with team decisions, don't forget about the student. I've got a couple students here. I always encourage my families to get students involved as early as possible. Thank you for mouthing that along. The sooner we can have our students having a voice, the easier it is to support them. Generally, my rule of thumb is elementary school, parents are talking with the students beforehand. Hey, what's going on? What do you want? What do you like in class? What teacher do you like? Where do you feel safe? Where do you feel comfortable? Who's making you feel like your best self? And get that information from the student. In middle school, I like to encourage my students to get involved, starting sometimes 4th, 5th grade, depending on the student. But by middle school, having some say, even if it's the first 15 minutes, the students coming and talking in the meeting and then leaving. And then in high school, I really, really like to push as much as we can to have 9 through 12 students involved in the meeting as much as possible, because that self-advocacy can be really important. And a lot of the times we hear from the students what they really need, what the real day-to-day is like. And the accommodations I see when we have students involved can be really, really beneficial, and things that the other grown-ups weren't thinking about that were really important to day-to-day. So 504 plans and IEPs. One of the kind of first things we hear about this is they have to be individualized. I think at this point in time, 20 years ago, there was a lot of predetermination. I'm seeing it less and less and less every day. Yeah. Yeah.
The earlier you get them in, it's kind of eliminate that window where I kind of try to teach and say, well, we're going to ask the child first, because once they reach 16, right, then they always want to refer back to what the child wants and bring the child in on their own without being present.
Yeah.
And so that kind of like makes that in the life.
Yeah, definitely. Very much so. And I also see situations where the child falls back and goes, oh, well, I've always been able to do this. Can you do this for me? And then I see these kids, especially in high school, where you can see the posture change, the attitude change when high school students say, hey, you've got a voice. Does school change suck right now? Is it way too overwhelming in this hallway? You've got a voice. What would actually help? And then you hear, well, it's a lot less scary when my friend Adam walks with me. I don't care that the hallways are crowded. In fact, it's embarrassing to go a different time. But if my buddy Adam's with me, I don't feel scared because he's like a cool guy. When the adults are going, oh, we need a time change and 5 minutes before class, the student's getting out. And the kid actually hates it. And, our kids aren't always totally telling us everything. It's the desire to go, Mom, it's super embarrassing, is not always there. But when you're in this empowered situation, you've got these people who you respect. You've got your teacher, your principal looking and going, what do you want? There's power in that to say, this is what I want to help me. And I really encourage my families to push for our kids in an appropriate fashion to be as involved as they can, starting as early as possible. Even if it's getting a video or a letter beforehand. Hey, this is a letter from the student. This is a video from the student. This is what they wanted me to read for them. Just starting as early as possible of including that advocacy, I've seen can be really beneficial. So 504 plans, predetermination used to kind of be something we heard a lot about. We hear a lot less about it now. But basically, they can't just say, oh, this is our standard accommodation plan for a kid in a wheelchair. This is our standard accommodation plan for a kid with ADHD. No, it must be individualized for the needs of the child. Every plan must be individual for the child. If you hear them saying, oh, well, usually what we always do for a child with this is this, and that's the option. Individualized for this specific child. If they're coming in saying this is the only option, that's going to raise a big red flag with me. Sometimes those options couldn't be good, but they are not the only option for you. It must be individualized, and that can be a point to push. The big buzzwords that I, as an advocate, come in and often try and use is FAPE and LRE. FAPE is free, appropriate public education. Education must be free for public schools. It must be appropriate. That's where we're going to individual for this child. We are teaching them the appropriate material to help them learn, help them grow. It must be public, open to everybody, no discrimination, et cetera, and so forth. Education, I think we get that in schools. Least restrictive environment is a big point that I like to push. Basically, yeah, it would be super easy to educate one kid alone in a room all day. We are going to meet all of their needs, teach them everything one-on-one. That is an incredibly restrictive environment. The goal is for all students to be in the least restrictive environment for their needs. This doesn't mean that every student does everything the same, but if there's a situation where you feel like the school is pulling the child out, isolating them, that we can be pushing that this is not our least restrictive environment. And then I encourage everyone, as we're making these goals and you're in the IEP or the 504 meeting, please, please, please set SMART goals. So that means specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, time-bound. Really focusing, especially as we're crafting accommodations and supports, on the S and the M, specific and measurable.
As different states go to voucher systems that connect students to private schools, how does that impact? I feel a curveball.
No, this is one of those things that you see where they're like, what's a topic that you could talk about for an hour straight in a bar? This is mine. I'm a blast at parties. So literally at a party, somebody asked me this question. I was like, are you sure? Are you sure you want to ask this question? Okay, wine. And so it depends. So actually, I meant to say this at the beginning. As Matt said, I am an attorney. I am not giving y'all legal advice. For each step, I encourage you to seek an advocate. What I am telling you is a broad understanding of the law and a summary of my prior experiences. I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm not your attorney. I encourage you, if you need an attorney, speak with an attorney. Don't sue me. Don't sue me. I've got good lawyer friends. So it depends. Theoretically, all these laws are federal laws tied to federal funding. If a school receives federal funding, when they do, they agree, hey, we will take your federal funds and we promise you we won't discriminate. Subtle laugh in the background. Where we get messy is charter schools, as they stand, receive federal funds. Charter schools struggled there for a while, about 10, 15 years ago, to grasp that this meant, hey, you too. Recently, charter schools have really done a good job of catching on, in large part to my old employer, that, hey, no matter what your charter says, no matter what your mantra is, you still have to provide a FAPE in the LRE and you cannot discriminate who enters into those doors. Are there creative ways charters still use to discriminate? Allegedly. Oh, yes. I didn't say it. She did. Where we are running into one of the biggest frustrations, for my personal opinion, is that vouchers are attempting to circumvent that requirement. The voucher is we are going to give the parent money to then pocket and pay the private school. It is an attempt to get around that receipt of federal funds. If I had more spare time, I would join the fight in fighting this. There are still some questions with it. There's an interesting situation where there's a private school in North Carolina who received federal COVID funds to pay support staff. And they received a discrimination complaint during the 6 months where they received federal COVID funds. And the government has decided, yes, they, in fact, at that point in time, because they received the federal COVID grant, were recipients of federal funds and were entitled to provide all their students with federal anti-discrimination protections that they normally wouldn't have had to. Because as I think we all know, private schools can do whatever they want. They can be the discriminating discriminator pants school of racism. And they can be that school and you can choose to send your child there. I would recommend against that personally, but they can do that. If they receive federal funds, they cannot. And so we have these private schools who are saying, yeah, no, we're going to discriminate against students with disabilities. We're not going to provide them services. We're going to discriminate on students based on race. We're only going to pick students of this race. They can do that if they don't receive those funds. Vouchers questionably allow them out of that. Again, I'm a blast at parties. So theoretically, right now where it stands generally, in most cases, is that those vouchers aren't providing these protections, and that's a means to get around it. And I hate it. So No, let's come back.
So, our school is supposed to have
Yeah. Or we'll get to questions in a minute, but we've kind of gone rogue Q&A, which I'm fine with. Yes.
told us that there are no goals.
Yes. So educational goals, you can look up Andrew F. is the 2017 Supreme Court case? Supreme Court, yeah. Andrew F. was Supreme Court case in 2017 that decided kind of about goals and IEPs. With 504s, there aren't educational goals. You can, at that point in time, have that conversation where if there is some kind of educational goal, you can get a little creative in pushing for a very weak IEP. That's more or less a 504 plus, but if you can make the argument that there is any kind of impact for a change in that educational environment, and then set those goals. So for IEP, set SMART goals. Look at Andrew F. For 504s, set SME accommodations. So I'm a lawyer. But so with that, please, please, please push the school to set specific and measurable 504 plan accommodations. So what the classic example I give on this is, if anyone suggests preferential seating, no preferential seating. That is the bane of my existence other than vouchers. Whose preference? The teacher's preference? Mom's preference? Barack Obama's preference? Way too broad. Where is that seating? The child should be seated close to the teacher in the front row, not close to the front of the classroom, in the front row. At the teacher's preference, at the student's preference, at the parent's preference. Changing only for math or English, be specific. Not only does this make sure that, what was it, Mr. Parker, who I made up, was our not helpful teacher, this is making sure that it's idiot proof. That the teacher who doesn't get it, gets it. You can't read a good accommodation and go, wait, where am I supposed to put the kid? You read that accommodation, you go, I know exactly the chair in my classroom that he's supposed to be sitting in, and he's sitting in that class in art, in English, in math, in social studies. It is clear. It is measurable. How far from the board? What does this look like? What is the situation if the classroom is all in circles? Be as specific as possible, because that way, one, if there's a failure to implement, you can point quickly and easily to what's failing to implement. And two, you make it easy for teachers to do right by the child. These are people with 20 plus kids in their classroom. If they're skimming through super quick, the more specific we can be, the more likely it is that all accommodations are going to be followed and followed through. So I really, really encourage to be as specific as possible. Also, as you're crafting these plans, I encourage folks to include provisions for as many things as possible. These plans go from the minute the school bus picks up to the end of the extracurricular day. We're not just talking about English. It's before school, it's in between classes, it's in art class, in PT, in OT, in assemblies, on field trips. Think about every minute of the day and what supports need to be in place, and then document what you're doing, what needs to be done to supports all through these activities. Because you can have a great 504 plan, but if there's no plan for what we're doing on the aquarium trip, things can go real awry real fast. So encourage and push your team to include provisions for everything you can think of that one off day. Also, you can include healthcare plans, you can include staff education. And as we're including these, think about doubling up. If there's one staff member who's the parapro, they may catch the flu one day. What do we do when our parapro has a cold? If there is, like we were talking about before, if we're sitting preferential seating front row, What are we doing when the classroom's set up in a circle? Thinking for all of these options and pushing for as many overlapping supports as we can. I would love to see a 504 that has a very specific just in case provision, or an IEP, either one, that has a specific just in case provision that's never used, then have that moment arise and go, oh shoot, we went to the aquarium and the aquarium has a playground and the playground has gravel. The playground has mulch, now what? Making sure that all these accommodations are provided for and all these instances are thought about can make what I like to see in terms of 504. Post-secondary, long story short, and we're going to have the next presentation about this, IEPs don't exist in college. 504 Title II still apply. Basically, you can't have those additional above and beyond supports, but you are entitled to accommodations. It is entirely the responsibility of the student. Parents of 18 and 1 day-year-olds cannot come in and say, let me help my student. The student has to be the person making that conversation. And then we go back to, let's bring the kid into the meeting as soon as we can, because in 18 years, they're walking into disability services in college saying, hey, I need supports. Not really. It depends. There's some schools where it can apply, but for the large part, it is just dealing with reasonable accommodations, not to level the playing, or not to modify the curriculum, but to level the playing field. So it can be additional time. It can be written lectures, but it can't be fewer questions, or sometimes it can be fewer questions, but it can't be make Calc 101 easier, where an IEP can say, make AP Calc easier. Yeah. You can sign consents, yes.
So that's one way
Yes.
to still sit with your kid and advocate at least,
Yeah.
you know, and be there for.
Yes. But the student has to be the one who comes in and says, I want that consent.
I find like a lot of us don't get coached on that.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a
And
really important fact to like encourage your child to let them know that you can ask for a parent or your whoever, an advocate.
Yeah. To come in.
Them, right? And that
Yeah.
and they can
Definitely. So real quick, I want to run through where can you go when concerns arise? There are a lot of places, each one with positives and benefits. At the district level, you have the grievance process. You'll get this paperwork. It's a process. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's not. Unofficially, you've got people that you can reach out to say, hey, this isn't working. Sometimes these channels are great. Sometimes they're not. There's a 504 coordinator. These sometimes have different names depending on where you are. Your school principal, office of the superintendent. These are areas that sometimes it really works to reach out to them. Sometimes very much less so. But you never know. Sending a really sweet email to the principal going, hey, I think we're struggling. Office of the superintendent, maybe they're for re-election. They may be super helpful or they may not. You can always ask for an IEE if at the district level things just aren't going right. IEE can sometimes be a way to kind of smooth that process out. At the state level, there are state level grievance processes. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not. It depends. And then at the federal level, you have my old employer, the Office for Civil Rights. This can be a really long process. But they do also offer a mediation in the first 180 days, where it's not mediation because not everyone's a trained mediator, but you can ask for an informal agreement process when you file online for them, and that typically can be faster. State to state, region to region, there are some offices are significantly better than others. Generally, you need to be the squeaky wheel to get your case resolved faster. But a cool thing about OCR is they also offer technical assistance. If you've got a nuanced question, you don't always have to hire an advocate to answer that question. You can call your local OCR office and say, hey, I have a question for technical assistance. Sometimes they're not very helpful. Sometimes they're incredibly helpful. when I was there, I told people, hey, keep my number on file. Tell me when your IEP meeting is. And if the school still has that question, I will set my calendar to be available. Call me in the middle of the IEP meeting and say, hey, I've got the federal government on the phone. Tell them what you told me about the independent evaluation. That was fun.
That'd be so fun.
It was so fun. But you can get somebody good if you get TA. You can call a couple times also and ask to speak with somebody different. Each office has some really great people in it. Each office has some less helpful people. But OCR can offer that free TA call where you can get that, hey, I've got a weird nuanced question. I know you can't give me legal advice, but what's the federal law on this? And that can provide that clarification. And you can tell your school, hey, if you're not sure about this, I talked to OCR. This is the number of the direct line or the direct email address of the person I talked to. If you want to get clarification before I feel like I need to file, you can email them. So those are kind of my thoughts of when concerns arise. Where are the options? There are obviously other options, but these are kind of my main thoughts. So with that, I think I've got a couple minutes for Q&A. If not, I'll be